I want to begin this presentation with a little contemplative exercise. If you don't mind, I know this is a theological gathering, but could we do just a moment of something contemplative? So, just get comfortable. You know how this thing goes. Put your feet, if you feel like you want to, feel free to close your eyes, relax. Now I want you to think about a purchase you made recently. Think about a purchase of some kind of product. Okay, got it in your mind? Good. Now, journey with me as I ask you a few questions about this product. First, think about the manufacturing process. Are there any parts in this product? Where did they come from? What kinds of natural resources were used? What happened to creation in order to acquire those natural resources that are going into this product? Were there different procedures used in the manufacturing of this product? Were there chemical procedures, mechanical procedures, biological procedures? How do these procedures affect the lands or the people involved? And what about harvesting or assembly or packaging procedures? Who worked to get the product ready for delivery? What were their working conditions like? Oh, now, think about the transportation of the product. How did it get to you? By what means brought the parts to assembly? What brought the assembled product to your purchasing place? What resources were used to get it there? Now, think about marketing. How did you learn about the product? And then finally, your purchase itself. Where did you buy it? Who sold the product to you? What are their working conditions like? Think about a purchase you made of a product. Okay, you can return to the room now. Good contemplative. We could have another 30-minute talk about what went on in that meditation, and it would be fun. It really would. And to share, my wife and I, we were chatting, and okay, what about if it's a purchase online, and what are people going to think about, and these sorts of things. So it was really fun to talk about, and maybe when we get to the question thing, you can do that. But just to let you know, what you were doing in this exercise is a very simplified version of what is known as life cycle assessment. There is such a thing as product life cycle assessment, whereas the editors of Taking Stock of Industrial Ecology describe, quote, "We identify the impacts of a supply chain leading to the delivery of a product or service." It's a whole field of study now. This identification of the social and environmental impact of goods and services plays an important role in what is known today as consumer ethics. Okay, think fair trade, think socially responsible business. Ethical consumers are concerned with the effects that a purchasing choice has not only on themselves, but on the external world around them. Now, union members, they boycott non-unionized companies with some view to their own benefits. So also for someone who wants to eat organic out of some concern for their own health, because of what the pesticides might be. But if my concern in eating organic is the pesticides on the wildlife, on the workers, or the soil, something like that, then it moves from just a personal concern to a concern for the wider populace, so to speak, and it's a different thing. The point of consumer ethics is that our purchasing choices are made with a view toward the world around us, other people, God's creation, so on. That's what ethical consumption deals with, is that field. Drinking fair trade coffee, investing in microloans, buying groceries from community-supported gardens. I could go on and on. Perhaps having future evangelical theological conferences in green buildings. Whoa, what about that? All of these are examples of what is discussed as consumer ethics. Now, a few concepts have to be grasped in order to conceive of consumption as ethics. First, we must understand economic structures and their relationships to cause. Daniel Finn, past president of the Catholic Theological Association of America, Society of Christian Ethics, Association for Social Economics. He writes in his book, Consumer Ethics in a Global Economy, and he writes about that book at this point. He's saying, the fundamental premise of this volume is that we can fully understand our moral responsibility as consumers in the market only if we recognize our causal role as consumers in the lives of distant others. So the moral responsibility is connected to the causal responsibility, the causal connection. Finn perceives this role in terms of human participation in a structure of interdependent relationships. He states, quote, "The price of coffee rises because of decisions that occur all along a chain of relations among positions, from plantation manager and coffee buyer here to coffee shop waitress and customer here." And there's a whole chain of relationships that go on to create that. A second and connected concept that you've got to get is this idea of structural sin. Ron Sider, in his Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, way back when, in 78, reminded evangelicals what biblical scholars had known all along, that God judges not merely individuals, but corporate entities. Facing consumer ethics brings us to cry out with Isaiah, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." It's that solidarity that we bring into us in our own confession. Our third notion that we have to get a grasp on in dealing with consumer ethics is the notion of complicity. I am more complicit in a beating when I hand the assailant a club. I am still complicit, but less so, when I merely stand and watch. Albino Barrera, in his Market Complicity and Christian Ethics, identifies 4 different levels of complicity in consumer behavior: benefiting and enabling a wrongdoing, precipitating gratuitous accumulative harms, leaving severe externalities unattended, and reinforcing injurious socioeconomic structures. He's got complicated terms, and we could get into that later, but you get the idea that there's different ways and levels at which we become complicit through our participation in structures. Complicity then leads us to a final concept, the possibility of a new strategy. Consumer ethics, in part, is sometimes about strategy, exercising our consumer practices, both with a view to values consistency, but also perhaps with a hope that our practice might influence others. Globalization, increased awareness of worker or environment impact, like some of you have heard of the sweatshop fire in Bangladesh a few years ago, a shift in market power toward consumer voice, and all of these and some more factors have contributed to kind of a growing interest in consumer ethics and consumer behavior in recent decades. Ethical Consumer, the pioneering magazine in the field, founded in 1989 in the UK, and by 2009 in the United States, they developed an app which unfortunately was later discontinued, to scan products. You can take your phone and scan the product, and it will rate that product on a number of different fields, environmental and social impact and things like that. Today, groups like Bloomberg and Reuters will give you a CSR rating, which is going to come corporate social responsibility ratings for your stock investments. Apps like Yelp are now developing user-generated environmental apps and things like that. Ethical reviews. Recognized standards such as B corporations, certified fair trade, these kinds of things are becoming more and more, common. You're seeing it everywhere now. And yet, consumer ethics is not necessarily as new as you might think. John Chrysostom urged his congregants not to engage in trades that produced useless goods or services. St. Elizabeth of Hungary often went hungry rather than partake of food and drink that were unjustly appropriated from peasants. And though I've not done the homework, there's actually a whole bunch of homework that could be done in this. I suspect that you just got a lot of other examples of this kind of thing throughout history. I've got some other work on poor in the Middle Ages, but anyway, I didn't go there. Authors Terry Newholm, Sandra Newholm, and Dieter Shaw, in their article on History for the Consumption of Ethics, draw particular attention to the 1791 UK boycott against slave-produced sugar. Not only was there a problem with rum, there was also a problem with sugar. They recount this boycott. They recount that this boycott was actually inspired by another gentleman, American Quaker John Woolman. And that brings us to John Woolman, member of the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers. I will introduce John Woolman's life in the first person, weaving in language and quotes from his own journal, one of my favorite devotional classics. And if I was doing this right, I would be putting on a white hat and have some different clothing on. Greetings, friends. My name is John Woolman, and I've come all the way from New Jersey to tell you something about my life. I was born in 1720, and from my childhood I was acquainted with the operations of divine love. After a season of youthful vanities, I experienced merciful heavenly visitations and was made to bow in the Spirit before the Lord. My understanding became more strengthened to distinguish the language of the pure Spirit, which inwardly moves upon the heart, and taught me to wait in our meetings in silence, until I felt that rise which prepares the creature to stand like a trumpet, through which the Lord speaks to his flock. Perhaps a key turning point for me was in 1742, when I was 22 years old. My employer, having a Negro woman, sold her, and directed me to write a bill of sale, the man being waiting who bought her. Through weakness, I gave way and wrote it. But in executing it, I was so afflicted in my mind that I said before my master and the friend who purchased the woman that I believed slavery to be a practice inconsistent with the Christian religion. I endeavored to order my life in a plain way, working as a tailor and in other trades, for I saw that an humble man, with the blessing of the Lord, might live on little. I gained respect from my local congregation and received a recommendation to visit other meetings. And this began a nearly 25-year journey of periodic visitations throughout the colonies. I took occasion to speak both with slaves and slave owners, and to become acquainted with their conditions, often taking a friend with me. And when I say friend, it's a capital letter F, because it's a society of friends. The knowledge of our conduct toward the Negroes has deeply bowed my mind. Some who owned slaves were glad of our visits, and in some places the way was more difficult. I often saw the necessity of keeping down to the root of where our concern proceeded, allowing the Lord to beget a spirit of sympathy and tenderness toward me, in me, towards some who were grievously in the spirit of this world. I wrote Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, A Plea for the Poor, and other essays. I spoke not only about slavery, but about oppression in factories and farms, about our care for the natives of this land. Ultimately, my journeys took me to England. There I contracted smallpox and died in 1772. Soon after my death, the Society of Friends gave up the practice of slave keeping, decades before what you call the abolition movement gained strength. Okay, so much for Woolman's life. Now, for Woolman's consumer ethics, I'll present what I've discovered reading Woolman's journal and his essays and things like that in terms of the 4 concepts I outlined above, though I'm not going to do it exactly in the same order. First, structural sin. Woolman's own reflections on his youthful vanities, along with discussions of the dangers of magic shows, frequenting public houses, wearing frivolous clothing, and the like, identify him as associating with what in the 18th century was called the Quaker Reform, a movement both to purify within and evangelize without. Woolman was clearly a part of this movement at the time. And what I don't know, and would be really fascinating, again, is to see, Woolman is just not that far away from where Jonathan Edwards lived, and the Great Awakening is going on. And every once in a while, Woolman talks about relationships with other meetings, and he's dealing with a wider crowd. But I have no clear sense of him, any mutual imbibing. I just don't know. So anyway, it'd be really fun to see where the dialogue between some of these movements are going on. Central to the problems of sin and the world, as Quaker reformers perceived it, was their attachment to wealth. As Ross Eiler summarizes, leading Quaker reformers viewed the levels of comfort and the material world enjoyed by many Quakers as problematic. Not inherently bad, yet somehow connected to the society's perceived spiritual decline. Quakers are starting to get lax. And that lax is due to wealth. That kind of connection went on. I think John Woolman, frankly, even went further. He blames the inordinate pursuit of wealth for a host of ills, not only among the Society of Friends, but in the world more generally. The mistreatment of animals, corruption of sailors, oppression, inequality, war, and more. All of this is in distinct contrast to those values that John Woolman saw as the heart of what he calls the government of Christ: good work, plain living, compassion for others, and more, but that's a summary. Next, structure. So sin, now structure. As one who managed a retail shop, Woolman was very aware of the life cycle of the products that he bought and sold. For example, Woolman recounts how he used to sell rum in his earlier days with little concern, quote, save only that the rum might be used in moderation. But that, later, quote, being further informed respecting the oppressions too greatly exercised among slaves, utilized in rum production, he decided to change his practice. He speaks of tracing our claim to homeborn Negroes to the bottom. And then in his plea for the poor, Woolman speaks of the economic system that leads from the desire for wealth into war as, quote, a chain where the end of one link encloses the other. He's conscious, Woolman is conscious of these links from supply, to purchase, all the way along. He exhorts his readers, may we look upon our treasures and the future of our houses and the garments in which we array ourselves and try meaning weigh or evaluate, whether the seeds of war have any nourishment in these our possessions or not. Now, as you can see from this quote, Woolman was not only conscious of the life cycle of the products and services in his world, but because of that, he was also burdened by our own complicity in sinful systems. War, slavery, the plight of natives, suffering of animals, and more. Thus, he cautions that, and again I quote, in the trading in or frequent use of any produce known to be raised under such lamentable oppression hath appeared to be a subject which may yet require the more serious consideration of the humble followers of Christ. He is saying it's not just a matter of whether we're generous or not. It's not just a matter of whether we're rich or poor. It's how do we use our wealth. It's what is the connection. What are we investing in when we buy this product? That's the kind of thing he's saying. Likewise, in his consideration on keeping Negroes part second, after recounting some of the cruelties involved in procuring slaves, and he recounts them in detail, he laments, and we make ourselves parties and fellow helpers in them. Although the first and most striking part of the scene is done at a great distance and by other hands, yet everyone who is acquainted with the circumstances and notwithstanding joins in it for the sake of gain only must, in the nature of things, be chargeable with the others. There's Woolman's comment to Whitefield on that subject. Awareness of complicity, then, leads to us to consider strategy, the fourth point. What do we do in light of what we know? On the one hand, Woolman was just trying to restore traditional principles of Quaker discipline. We review our behavior as communities and individuals in light of the concerns God has brought to our attention. Quakers would talk about queries. You identify queries that you as a congregation ask oneself. Are we doing this? Yet, as Jeffrey Plank observes, by observing those moral practices to a new range of social ethics, they were on their way to discovering a new approach to politics. Eventually, they would come to believe that they could exert influence more pervasively and extensively than any government could, just by keeping an eye on the global implications of their daily conduct. Consumer ethics. Woolman, aware of the range of the tactics used by Christians in socio-political engagement, chose to respond to the situations of his day by ordering his economic habits very intentionally. He stopped selling goods produced by the slave trade or which were implicated with violence, a choice that endangered, frankly, it really endangered his business as a tailor, or as a retailer, because people told him, if you don't sell rum and sugar and something, he's like, how can you be a retailer? He chose not to. Ultimately, there's a whole discussion about this, but he requested not to eat with silver utensils. He changed the way he dressed. He refused to ride in carriages where the animals were mistreated. While on the one hand, attention to lifestyle reflected his traditional values, especially as a Quaker reformer, Woolman and his friends, in their setting and circumstances, were beginning to discover, as Plank observes, that they could help affect change by performing demonstrative gestures. We call this boycott now. It's a normal word. Here we see not only the purely ethical aspect of Woolman's practice, but also the political dimensions of Woolman's consumer ethics, recognizing that purchasers were not merely passive consumers, but were active participants in the market, able to shape the system itself by their purchasing habits. Okay, John Woolman practiced consumer ethics before we called it that. He consciously chose his economic practices as a response to complicity and harmful structures. Yet, living when he did, Woolman's example is not really able to help us identify the precise links in the global economic chain of today. It's great in his day, what about today? Did you notice, by the way, when you did your meditation, Sherry and I were talking about this, because she said, when I led her through the meditation, I said, did you ever come to a time where I asked you about certain things, this link and this link and this link, and you said in your mind, well, I don't know. I don't know who produced this. I don't know what processes were involved. Guess what? Bingo. That's the point. We don't know. It's normal. It actually requires a bit of homework when it comes to noticing complicity and discovering appropriate contemporary responses. With regard to consumer complicity, this is just Evan Howard here, I've been exploring an outline of like 3 functions of our own consumer behavior. And this might be a helping start. First, by my particular purchases of goods and services, consumers, myself here, less knowingly contribute to the economic demands for goods and services, I'll call them products, produced in contexts of oppression. So, part of my impact as a consumer is with regard to the product itself. If I buy this product, I am telling them I want more of this. Make more of these. And of course, nowadays we've got Safeway cards and things that actually document all of that sort of thing. Second, by our purchasing habits, consumers support those companies, I call them producers, that meet demands a little more knowingly by negotiating products and prices and supplies that deliver products and services in the context of oppression. When I taught ethics in a secular university setting, we analyzed some of this and talked about that. There's a book called The Walmart Effect, although obviously Walmart is not the only person that does this. And I don't want to try and blame Walmart in this thing. It's just what happens is that when you try and reduce prices, you push those off onto suppliers. Suppliers are forced to, make changes, and it goes all the way back to the manufacturing process itself. And it gets more and more knowing, if you know what I mean, in terms of the harm caused, the further back you get. Finally, by our life, so our purchases, our habits, now our life, consumers reinforce or re-educate the value sentiments, relationships, and practices, I call them principles, that govern the manufacture, distribution, and use of goods and services, either manufactured, delivered, or used in contexts of oppression. I think more important than my own brief comments here on that, Christians are now publishing valuable contributions on this whole subject. There's a bunch of stuff on Christian consumer ethics that's out there nowadays. I've been developing my own approach for the past few years under the heading of fasting from oppression, and I can't get into all of what I think of fasting from oppression now. At least if I want to do summary, avoiding our participation, to me, fasting from oppression means avoiding the products, the producers, the principles that bring gain to some at the expense of harm to others. And that's kind of where I'm messing with this. Yet, there is one aspect of our contemporary practice of consumer ethics where I think Woolman provides much needed wisdom. I was thinking about doing the whole fasting from oppression things, and no, let's go back to Woolman. Let's go back to Woolman. You see, John Woolman was not only an activist, but he was a mystic. He speaks much of hearing God's voice within, of going deep, of examining one's heart. I mean, Woolman's going wide into the issues of slavery, war, native rights, etc., was rooted in his practice of going deep. You got that? Deep and wide, deep and wide. Anyway, so with that in mind, let's close with a second contemplative exercise. One that in my, I mess around with this, I've edited it greatly, but it's a little bit like, I've got a book coming out, Deep and Wide, Reflections on Monasticism and Socio-Political Engagements, and this is kind of a little bit of that. I call it socio-political self-examination. Once again, get comfortable. Return again to your thoughts of that purchase. Let's go back to that purchase. That one product. Spend some time just being with that product again, having heard what we've heard. What does this element look like? What sounds are associated with the product? Any smells? How do you feel when you imagine this product? Then, try to recall or think anew the system or systems within which this product has its life cycle. Imagine the resources, the product development, the transportation and marketing. Imagine the systems that are involved in your purchase. Now, let's try and bring God into this picture. What does Jesus think about this product? What might Jesus think of the processes involved in the production of this product? What are God's concerns about the economic practices involved in bringing this product to your possession? Does God have any concerns? Next, bring your purchase, your God, and you all together. Try to go deep. Let the Holy Spirit speak. What motives, what hopes, what inner voices are present in this purchase? How do they reflect your relationship with God more generally? How does this purchase reveal your own relationship with the world, the flesh, the devil, the divine? Finally, we offer ourselves to God. In the words of John Woolman, Lord, let us be about your business. Let us be careful to have our minds redeemed from the love of wealth. Let no temporal concerns entangle our affections or hinder us from diligently following the dictates of truth. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.